Hi everyone and welcome to Magic Numbers, and this is episode 24. The sagas begin and I'm going to talk about the first Kamigawa Dynasty data. I'm going to dedicate probably an unruly amount of time to the ninjutsu effect because there was several questions about how does the ninjutsu impact win rates and why does the ninjutsu impact win rates. So I'm going to explain exactly what's happening there in the data and how you can sort of try to look at the 17 lens data and see how exactly does it impact it. And then I'm going to chat about archetype openness and speculate a bit about where it's going. And we're going to go through all the archetypes and look at interesting commons and uncommons and what is going well in each color combination. Okay. But I'm going to start with the preamble. As always, a quick soapboxy moment where I'm discussing particular aspect that drew my attention today. So I'm going to talk about sample size. And there is this big idea from lots of people, to be fair, that sample size is very important. And yes, I do agree. It is important. Bigger sample sizes make reliability of the data more predictable. But the data quality matters more. And this is especially interesting and important in the first weeks of the format when people just don't build good decks yet. And that can muddle a bit the picture of the format. And also, some cards are open early in the format, then they start being picked at the appropriate rate as the format matures. And this is also changing. Like the first 2 weeks of data is not exactly the same as the data from a more mature format. And I wanted to go into the example from a history where that was exactly the case. And in 1936, Literary Digest, an American newspaper or magazine, polled their readers and a huge amount of population on who is going to become a president. And according to their survey, and their survey was just gigantic. No one ever before and after did this kind of polling. They sent the questionnaire to 10 million people and they received roughly 2.2 million replies. And based on that data, they just decided that Roosevelt is going to lose the election by quite a large margin, actually. The history turned out to be completely different. Roosevelt won the election by quite a large margin by carrying all but 2 or 3 states, I think. And then became, of course, the longest serving president of the United States. And the issue with that poll was that they were mocking Gallup, who did, pretty sizable poll, I think around 20 to 50,000. I don't remember exactly. And they were mocking him from a small sample size, and that this kind of small sample size does not even compare with what they did. And famously, they completely mispredicted it and lost the competition with Gallup, although he used much smaller sample size. And because of that, first of all, the magazine just dissolved a couple of years later because, it was an embarrassing defeat. But it also changed how we poll things and how we look at the polling data and how we generate the polling data. And the thing that happened in case of Literary Digest was that, first of all, they sent mostly the surveys to their readers, and their readers were not a perfect sample, and that distorted the results. And also, what people analyzed later, it was the case that they sent those 10 million surveys, but people who were more likely to respond to the survey were the ones that felt very strongly against Roosevelt, which turned out to be Republican voters in that case. And because they had the disproportionate response rate, they skewed the results even more than the actual reader selection. And this is something to think about when you look at the limited data. It's even with ginormous sample sizes, if you only based yourself on the day 1, day 2 of the format, you might go to completely wrong conclusions for what happens later in the format, because the data quality in the first days is just not very high. First of all, as I said, some cards are wide open, some color combinations are wide open, which changes as the format matures. And second of all, as I also mentioned, people don't build their decks well, which might especially hurt particular types of cards, the cards that are difficult to build around, the cards that require some knowledge of the format functioning, the cards that need careful planning and playing. So because of that, don't get super focused on sample size. Of course, it's nice to have a big sample size, but think hard about the quality of the data that you're looking at when you try to draw some useful conclusions. Right, talking about that. Data summary for this talk. I got the first glimpse of the data from 17 lands from the first 5 days or so. So as always, thank you to 17 lands. Why does it say land? I have to correct that because I can't stand that. There we go. So it's based on 160,000 games and 26 or so thousand drafts. So this is decent sample size. The quality, well, that remains to be seen. How good is the quality? And in limited data from my experience, there are some things that are tricky to conclude in the first weeks and some things that are actually all right in the first weeks. Most of the time, strength of the cards is generally well estimated. There might be some discrepancies with a particular type of cards. But the deck's data, they will change over the first couple of weeks, because the tendency is that in the first week, the most open deck is going to be the one with the highest win rate, because people just don't know, people don't pick the right cards, and because of that, win rates get skewed. Okay, but before I will dive into the actual Kamigawa data, I'm going to talk a bit about the Ninja Conundrum. And the Ninja Conundrum is that game in hand win rate is the most commonly used stat from the 17 lands. And it is probably the most useful stat as well. I really do use it most of the time when I present data, because it just tells you so much. Game in hand win rate is when you had the card in your opening hand or you drew it later in the game, and what is the win percentage of the games when it happened. But game in hand win rate has a couple of particular problems in terms of computing, and there's been a discussion between Sam Black and Mike Sigrist that I somehow got involved in, where that topic was raised. We knew that there is an issue with the game in hand win rate since Strixhaven, where we basically found that Rutha had a very weird stats that just didn't make any sense. And based on that, we reanalyzed what was going on in there, and it turns out that the game in hand win rate does not cope with a couple of things. One of them is cards with high copy numbers. There is a slight distortion of the win rate based in cards that have a high copy numbers, and also cards that return to hand in some way. So it can be that either they bounce themselves back to the hand, or that when they go into the graveyard, you can return them to hand. These type of cards are problematic. And why is that? So this is all how the data is computed. So the problem with Arena is that Arena will show you which cards were drawn, but it doesn't show you that the network disruptor that the person drew is the same copy that they played on turn 1, or is it a different copy? So if you have 3 of them, you don't know exactly which one was being played and which one came back to hand. Now, if you bounce it, it appears in the hand as if it was drawn, and the calculations for the win rate take that into account that it was drawn again. And that leads to a thing like this. If you have 1 copy of a card and you've drawn it once, it creates 1 data point for a particular game. So if that game was won, it counts as 1 win. If game was lost, it counts as 1 loss. If you have 2 copies of a card and it was drawn once, it creates 2 data points, because we don't know which copy of that card was drawn. So basically, if you have 2 copies of a particular card in your deck and you've drawn 1 copy during the game, it generates 2 data points. So if the game was won, it makes 2 wins, and if game was lost, it creates 2 losses. And it goes on. So if you have 2 copies but you draw them twice, it creates 4 data points. So you multiply the number of copies by the number of the card drawn. So in the same way, if you have 4 copies of a card and you draw them twice, it generates 8 data points. And it comes from one game. So this one game generates 8 data points. If you won it, it counts as 8 wins, basically, for the purpose of calculation of the win rates. So there are 2 things that really distort it. And first of all, is that cards that return to hand. So some cards and mechanics will enable returning a particular card into hand. Arena doesn't let us distinguishing which copy returns, and this inflates the data, very much like copy number will. So if I have like 3 network disruptors and I ninjutsu'd one of them twice, that means I drew it 3 times, and I drew the second one, that's 4 times. So that's 3 times 4, that's 12 data points generated for this game for this particular card. And it inflates data by quite a lot if you bounce a card quite frequently. And the problem would not exist if the games when I bounce this network disruptor a lot of times would end up with the same win rate as the games when I don't. But it's not the case. In case of lots of those cards, it is not the case at all. So here I have the win rates for network disruptor based on the number of network disruptors drawn. So if I draw 1, the win rate is 56. Well, nothing out of the impressive. If I draw it twice, the win rate goes up to 64%. If you draw it 3 times, it's up to 70%, and if you draw it 4 or more, it goes up to 72%. So in the games when I've drawn it multiple times, let's say I drew it 4 times, I have 3 copies in my deck, that means 12 data points, I have a much higher chance of winning, which will slightly inflate the win rate. But, fear not. If we know that there's a problem, there are solutions. It's just that those solutions are hard to apply on the data tables because that requires a lot of other computations if you want to do it properly, and just there is not enough bandwidth to deal with that kind of stuff. So there are simple solutions that you can apply on your own. So first of all, it's very, very easy to figure out which cards are particularly problematic in terms of their copy numbers in the deck. And some cards you just want to have multiple copies of. You can think about Ancestral Anger from Crimson Vow or Shipwreck Sifters from Midnight Hunt. You wanted to have as many copies of this card as possible in your deck because first of all, they were becoming better in multiple copies, and second of all, they boosted themselves in some way. So in the data tables that you get in the 17 lands, you will get numbers of games played and numbers of games that the card was in the opening hand. Now, we can safely assume that most decks are 40 card decks. It actually is 95% of the decks in 17 lands are 40 cards, and then there's like 4% of the 41 cards decks and 1% of things that have more than 41 cards. So for simplicity, we assume that there is a 40 card deck. From there, we can calculate that the number of a card, if you had 1 copy of it exactly in the deck, should be 17.5% of the time. Because 7 divided by 40 is, well, 0.71175. So from these numbers, you can easily calculate this number. And if it's not 17.5, and in fact, if it's quite far from 17.5, it means that this card is played very frequently in multiples. So you more often have multiple copies of it in your deck. And in case of some cards, you will just get, around this 17.5%. So I did it for some cards in the format just to show you. So basically, I can divide this 13,400 number of Okiba Reckoner rate being in the opening hand I can divide it by 48,000 of the games played with that card, and I come up with around 28%. 28% is way more than 17.5%. And if you recalculate it, it means that you probably have like an average of 1.6 copies of this per deck if you have at least one of them in the deck. That doesn't take into account the decks with 0 copies. And we can look at different cards. Imperial Oath, it's around 1.2 copies per deck. Moon Circuit Hacker 1.5, Virus Beetle 1.4 copies per deck, and so on and so on. So these are the cards that are particularly abundant. I didn't select random cards here. Oh yeah, Network Disruptor 1.54 copies per deck, also quite a lot. I didn't pick random cards. I picked the ones that actually had multiple copies and also had a high game win rate. But there is also the second problem. Like you already have a lot of Network Disruptor, so this is the card that will have 1.54 copies per deck. But Network Disruptor is probably the most likely card to get bounced while you're playing it. And how can we actually calculate how big is the problem of bouncing? So apart from number of games played and games in the opening hand, we have the number of games where the card was drawn. And this also should follow a particular set of rules. The games will vary slightly in length. Maybe some decks will have more card draw or whatever. But in general, it should average out, and the number of games that the card was drawn should be somewhat related to the number of games played. And of course, the number of times that the card is drawn will also depend on the number that you have in your deck. So what I did in the next analysis is I basically divided the number of games drawn by the number of games played. And I sort of took all the cards from the set and sort of plotted them on this graph. So basically, there is the main trend of the more of the copies of the given card you have in your deck on average, the more likely you will be able to draw it. But there are some cards that completely are out of this regression. And because it's a simple linear regression, we can sort of get a formula to calculate where would you expect a particular card based on this number to be on that graph. Oh, thank you for the raid, Matt Moses, by the way. And thank you for the sub to Duck Cubed. So for example, this here point is the 1 mana 2/2 haste samurai that gets bounced into your hand after it attacks at the end of turn, and not after it attacks. So you can see that because this card will almost always get bounced to your hand, this number of the times that you draw it is super inflated because it will always bounce back. So if you attack with it twice, it will be bounced. You will basically count as drawing it 3 times during that game. So this card is super inflated by this bounce effect. And Network Disruptor is also very much inflated by that effect, but not to the scale that that the Samurai is. However, the Okiba Reckoner raid, it's more or less where you would expect it to be based on the number of copies in the deck. So you can see that the bouncing problem does not apply to the Okiba Reckoner raid, but it does apply to the oh god, where is my laser pointer? The laser pointer should be laser point. But Network Disruptor is bounced by inflated by this bounce effect. So based on this equation, I sort of calculated. Okay, wait, one thing after another. So the distance between this trend line and the data point will tell you about the bounce size, effect size. So basically, how frequently is the card bounced and how big a problem is that for a particular card. And then for each card, you can also sort of calculate the win rate based on the number of copies drawn. And you can say, what is the impact on the win rate of the particular card when you calculate how many times it was drawn. And of course, for some cards, it's going to be positive. For some cards, it will be negative. obviously the ones where it's negative, you probably shouldn't play when you bounce it, and you're actually more likely to lose the game. That's probably not going to be a great card. So here we have several cards, and they are sorted by the size of the how inflated is games drawn to games played ratio compared to where they should be. So, for example, the Reinforced Ronin, the games drawn to games played is 1, which means that it is on average drawn once per game it's played. In every game, in more than every game, you draw 1 copy of it. Obviously, it's not true, because we know that there are games where it wasn't drawn, which means that in the games where it is drawn, you draw it several times because it bounces into your hand, and because the silly arena doesn't tell you that it was bounced, but just counts it as being drawn, and the data has a problem with it. So based on how many copies you have on average of that card in the deck, you would expect this ratio to be 0.34. It is 1.03. So the bounce effect is 0.7, roughly. And it's the biggest one that any card has. And then we can have some other cards that have quite a large effect. Shigeki Jukai Visionary, that's a rare that you can bounce to look for lands. That's one of the cards that has the highest bounce ratio, because people want to play it, use the ability, draw some lands, and then in the end channel it to tutor for some was it tutor or draw? Well, to do something with the cards. Oh no, bring stuff back from your graveyard. That's the one. And Network Disruptor, another card that is bounced quite a lot. But from that, we only know how frequently the card is being bounced into your hand. We also can see that actually Network Disruptor has a quite high expected game drawn to game played ratio, which is related to the number of copies that it has. Like, for example, Shigeki is usually in 1 copy per deck, and the number is much lower. And Thousand Faced Shadow, which is also a card that is frequently bounced because it's basically like a Network Disruptor plus. This one also, like, the expected game drawn to game played is low, because you only will get 1 copy because it's a rare, so you will rarely have multiple copies of it. And we can also see that Okiba Reckoner Rate, which has high games drawn to games played ratio, has a very low bounce effect. So it's rarely bounced. The main reasons for it being inflated is because you play more than 1 copy, because people that can draft it will draft it in multiple copies, because the card is just amazing, as we will learn a bit later. So there we can quantify the game in hand bias. So we can actually see how big is the size of that effect on game and hand ratio. And for that, I will introduce the idea of the weighted and unweighted measures. And this is something, well, we use a lot in science work, because weighted measures take into account the frequency of certain factor. Unweighted measure only look at it qualitatively. So in my work, I very often look at the composition of the environment. I have 100 species, and I can look at relatedness of 2 samples by looking at which species are present and absent, and that's the unweighted measure. And that sort of lowers the impact of high frequency species, but increases the impact of rare species. So if I want to look at something that is related to rare species, I will not weight it. I will treat, okay, this is the most numerous species. I'll still treat it like it's 1 because it's present, or 0 because it's absent. And this species is super rare, but it will have the same weight as the super popular species, because I want to look at those rare species. I want to inflate their impact on the community. Or I can use the weight measures, and in weight measures, I will, if I have like 5,000 cases of the most numerous species, and there is 10,000 specimens in total that I analyze, I will make the 5,000 divided by 10,000, so half of the data will be weighed towards this species, which will mean that those super rare species are going to have almost no impact on my analysis, because I will put the weight on them, but there will be like 2 of them divided by 10,000. That's like 1 in 5,000. So it will not put much input into my data. So just to give you an example, if you would look at the average salary of those 5 jobs, we have fire marshal, baker, nurse, chef, and owner of an online bookstore. And we have their annual salaries of 25K, 20K, 23K, 21K, and 78 million K. We can calculate it in several ways. So we can do unweighted average, and we will just add the 25, 20, 23, 21, and 78 million divided by 5, and we come with some kind of astronomical number. Or we can look at it by number of occurrences. So we have 40,000 fire marshals, 35,000 bakers, 120,000 nurses, and 45,000 chefs, and 1 owner of the bookstore. We will sort of make an average. So we will, that's around 240,000. So 40,000 divided by 240,000 times this, and 35,000 divided by 240,000 times 20K, and then 1 divided by 240,000 times 78 million K of the anonymous owner of an online bookstore. And then we come up with a much lower number because we weighed down this one outlier by weighing it. So that's exactly what I'm going to do with the data from the win rate. Obviously, we don't have that big disproportions in this data because it's basically a win rate is between 50% and maybe 70% max. So the disproportions won't be so big as in this super exaggerated example. But what we can do is we can calculate a sort of unweighted win rate. Because this one is weighted because we count each instance of something bouncing into the hand as a data point. So we inflate it like that. What you can do for that is, first of all, you can calculate how many times did you win while having a copy, and you don't care about how many. Like if you drew it 7 times or 1 time, it's the same. So how many times did you win when you had the card in hand at any stage of the game? And we can calculate it from the table that that you get in the 17 lands. You have the number of games played. There we go. We have a number of games played. We have a win rate of games played. And we have the number of games where we didn't draw a card, and that's the important part for that. And we have the win percentage of the games when you didn't draw it. So if you multiply the number of games played by the win rate, you have the number of total wins. And if you multiply the number of games when you didn't draw it by the win rate of when you didn't draw it, you have number of wins when you didn't win, which means that what remains, if you take away from the number of wins in total, the number of wins when the card was not in hand, you have numbers of wins when the card was in hand without this inflation. And then you can also deduct the number of games when you didn't draw it from the number of games played, and divide the wins in hand by the games that you had something in hand to get this unweighted measure for the win rate. So obviously I did it for the cards, and these are the top hits. So we have the game in hand win rate of Network Disruptor from the data was 62%. If I did the unweighted analysis, this drops to 58.7, I guess, or 0.6. I could have given you the extra digital points here, but you get the point. So the delta between those two measures is around 3.3 percentage points, which means that the win rate for the Network Disruptor is somewhere between those two values when you remove that inflation. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's 3.3%, 3.4% lower, but it's probably closer to the lower estimate. So it's probably like 3% lower than if we add this artificial inflation. And the same cards, the cards that lose the most on this treatment of the win rate are Thousand Faced Shadow, another card that is bounced quite frequently. That drops by 3 percentage points. Reinforced Ronin drops by 2.6 percentage points. Virus Beetle drops by 2.3 percentage points. Gloom Shrieker, another card that probably is bounced, but in a different way by the geothermal Kami. It also has a much lower win rate when you apply this normalization. And you know other cards that we have. There is Kappa Tech Wrecker, Spirited Companion, Circuit Mender. So these are like all very good targets for ninjutsuing back in a way. Moon Circuit Hacker, another ninja. High Speed Hoverbike, I guess that people also bounce it back to get this tap effect for racing situation. Moonsnare Specialist and Shigeki, the land drawing creature I mentioned before. These all make sense that they are inflated because they are bounced, because these are all cards that you would want to return to your hand. Okay, so that's basically the picture of it. So yeah, just to summarize, yes, there is an effect of bouncing cards back to your hand, and to some smaller extent of having multiple copies on the game and hand win rate. As you can see, the most numerous card in the old decks, the Okiba Reckoner Rate, is not on that list. So bouncing has a higher impact on this game and hand win rate than multiple copies of the card have. But you still see some kind of inflation. So when I looked at the Okiba Reckoner Rate, it's around 1% extra that it gets from these multiple copies. Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, Network Disruptor is still a great card. At 59% win rate is something that you will be very happy with. And as I said, this doesn't mean that this win rate is lower by that much, because there are some other effects that come into play. Like you still do play multiple copies and draw multiple copies. You should probably limit it slightly less, because if you draw 2 copies, you should still treat it as 2 data points, not maybe as 4 data points. So part of this inflation is actually needed. That's why it's so hard to remove it completely. Yeah. Okay. But having said all that, we can slowly dive into the Kamigawa results. So after the first week, I looked at the win rate by color pair, and I calculate my win rate by color pair slightly differently than 17 Lands does, so there is a caveat there. I look at both decks that are 2 colors and the decks with the light splash. And the picture is relatively clear. I think we have sort of 2.5 tiers. 3.5 tiers. The tier of their own is black-green. And I see in the chat that people were very surprised by the black-green. I wish I could say I wasn't, but I was surprised as well. I assumed that, black-green is going to be what it always been in the last couple of sets. Boring deck with mediocre results. But it turns out, no. Now, we're going to look at why is that so in a second, but for now, black-green is the thing to do in the format. It looks amazing. The 57.8% win rate is just sick. Then we have a second tier decks, which are not far, but not close. They are roughly 1 to 1.5 percentage points below the black-green. And we're talking about Selesnya, we're talking about Demir, we're talking about Rakdos, and we're talking about Simic. They are between 56.8 and 56% win rate, which is relatively close to each other. So these decks all look fine. Then we have like sort of in between the worst decks and the best decks. We have the Orzhov, which sits at a comfortable 55.3% win rate. And then we have 4 decks that perform markedly poorer. And that's Izzet, Azorius, Gruul, and Boros. Boros being the last. That's something very novel, because usually Boros is in the top 3 archetypes in most sets. And this time it's not. I think the last time that happened was Strixhaven, when they also tried something different with Boros. Turns out that just just do attacking creatures. That's Boros. That's its personality, and then it's pretty good. Having said that, so the lower tier decks are between 54% and 52.7%. So not a terrible win rate. I mean, it's not great, but if you there might be some caveats about why some of those decks are performing poorly. So I have to say that I didn't play a lot. I played maybe like 7 drafts, but I had 3 trophies out of it, and 2 of them were in the white red, and 1 was in white blue. So you can clearly get success with those decks, but maybe it requires, in my case, string of luck, and in other cases, careful thinking. And I especially think that the Azorius is a much better deck, and it suffers from people misbuilding it atrociously. And I'm not saying that because I think that people are bad in building Azorius, but I think that the data suggests that people could draft Azorius better. And I'm going to explain it in a second. What the Sphinx revealed as saying 17 lands players must be much better than average. Otherwise, it's hard to explain all combinations to have 52 plus win rate, right? Yes, the average win rate of 17 lands user in this format is exactly 56%. So they are much better than the average. That's something that you should keep in mind. But it also makes the data slightly better because you already get the data from people that in majority know how to win, which means that the advice from them will be slightly better, I guess, that you're better informed about doing the right things. You don't get lots of these decks that are just well, sometimes decks are bad and some people are just starting to draft and they will maybe draft worse decks, at least while they're learning, and you get this data largely excluded because, well, 17 lands is unfortunately in some ways unfortunately used mainly by grinders that are married to playing limited and just spend all their free time drafting, which makes their draft decks better built. But it's good for learning good habits based on looking at the data, and especially when you go to the higher echelons of the players, you can get even stronger hints about what are the bad and good things in terms of building. And I'm definitely going to go much deeper in the data in the next coming weeks. Today I'm just starting with like general overview of the drafts and maybe looking a bit at the archetypes. I'm trying to fish out some. I will try to fish out some more impressive stuff in the next coming week. All right. So last time when we had Crimson Vow, I think I introduced this idea of color pair openness. And now I have to re-explain it because obviously there's always new listeners, there's always new people, so that's it's only fair that I explain it if not as deep as the first time. But basically, we know from the data the win rates of each card, and we know from the data the average last seen as metric. The average last seen as metric tells you more or less how many copies of the particular card you will see in a draft. Because we know what is the frequency of commons, we know what is the frequency of uncommons, we know what is the frequency of rares, and how many on average you will open in a pod. So for example, in Kamigawa, back of the envelope calculations suggest that you will have run 2.25 of each common per draft pod on average. Now, obviously, that means that in some drafts you open 6 and in some 0, but on average you have 2.25. So I calculate this color pair openness by looking at each archetype, and in each archetype I look at every card that has a win rate of over 56%, because of the average win rate of the 17 lands player in this set is 56, so I just say cards that are over average in each archetype. So I'm looking at the archetype specific data. And then because I know their rarities, and I know their alpha, I can sort of calculate how many cards you will get in each archetype that fulfill this criterion of having the win rate of 56% or more. And based on that, I declare color to be very open or not particularly open. So for example, black green, our best archetype in the format, has, you will see on average per draft 72 cards for that deck that have a win rate of 56% or more in the archetype. While on the other end of the spectrum in red green, you will see only 6.2 cards. So there is a massive difference between how likely you are to draft a good black green deck. Basically, if you see 72.2 cards on average that are good in the deck, you can start thinking about hard forcing it because you only need 23 of them. So you basically, in each pack that you look through, you will get like 3 good cards for the deck, which is insane when you think about it. So the colors that are most open, as I said, black green is the most open with 72. Then we have blue green, which is quite open at 63.5. So there's a good card selection available for people drafting blue green. Then there's white green 58.7, blue black 54, blue white 48, and this is an important. We'll jump into in the next slide. Ors of white black is 42, black red is 36, blue red is 21, and then we have 2 colors that are really lagging behind in white red and red green with only 6.5 and 6.2. So what the Sphinx revealed says, now I understand why I tend to end up with white green and blue green almost always. I never want to be in those colors, but it organically happens from reading signals. Yeah, those colors, if the colors are open and if you have like maybe a slight preference for them, you will end up in them a lot because you have visualized what you want to do and you see the cards that you want to see and you just draft them, and that makes it quite easy to end up in the deck. So let's just compare side by side the win rate and the openness, and you can see that black green is the most winningest deck, and it's also the most open, which is sort of linked because of course the deck that wins a lot will have more cards that have a high win rate in it, but it's not only like that. For example, well, white green is the 3rd most open color, 2nd most winning color, and blue green is the 5th archetype, but it's really still closely clustered with all the other ones, and is the 2nd most open one at the same time. However, there's a couple of slightly interesting things. One of them is that blue-white has a low winning rate, but it has high openness of the good cards for that deck. Now, what that makes me think is that people build white-blue badly. And I think that I don't have the data to support it, but my intuition tells me that people try to build it as a vehicle deck, and the vehicle is just not good. But it can be built very well as a control-ish kind of maybe tempo control-ish or just control-ish deck, where cards are available because you can get 48 of them. You see 48 of them per draft, which is quite a lot. But people don't pick the right cards. And that's why the win rate is low. Because, you know, if you see 50 cards with win rate 56 plus in this archetype, and the average win rate of the archetype is 53, I'm quite convinced that people just didn't figure out good builds yet. And lots of people try to do this, you know, archetype kind of mumbo jumbo when you can just focus on good value creatures and draft it. So I'm predicting that blue-white's win rate is going to vastly increase over the duration of the format. So 72. So Alex is asking, what does the 72.2 on the right graph stand for? It means how many cards with a win rate of 56% or more in the game in hand win rate stat you will see for this color combination in a draft. So obviously you see multiple cards per pack for an archetype, because you know you open a pack, you have 15 cards, and if 5 of them are for the given archetype and all of them have a win rate of over 56, then you will see 5 cards in that pack, and then you know as the draft progresses you will see fewer and fewer. But if the color is open, even late you will see good cards for that deck. Of course, some of those cards are pretty situational. so you can't just count them like you can't have like as many copies of it as possible. And some cards are just staples and you want them every single time. um, I didn't go into detail, but last time I also did this graph when I showed how many bombs, how many very solid cards, and how many like over replacement cards you will see. So maybe I should have done that graph. Strapped for time. But yeah, so from the graph you can clearly see that white, red, and red, green are not open because there are not enough good commons for that deck around. And that may change when people start building better and some win rates are going to increase. You will see that the openness increases. It might also happen that because the color will become more open, the decks will become better and the win rate will get bigger. But I have to say, I had good success with white, red, and red, green. I can't even imagine a good deck. So I have a problem even at conceptual level of building. I mean, unless it's like a green deck with a couple of red cards for splash. Okay, so now we have this idea of openness. Is there anything interesting here? I think that, yeah, blue red is slightly sus in terms of is it a deck, and I think that this deck has a lot of potential, but it requires particular conditions to be fulfilled. So I don't know if that's ever going to happen. That blue red can become a good build around, and are there builds that are easily accessible that you can draft that will have higher win rate? I still don't know if that happens. So I'm a bit on the fence whether blue red is a viable deck that requires very careful building, or is just a bad and unsupported archetype because artifacts are so much worse than the enchantments in this format. I tend to maybe lean towards the latter, but hopefully we'll see in a couple of weeks. So as I said, this is the first 5 days data, and I think that until end of next week, treat the data cautiously because the quality of the data is still low because people are still learning how to draft decks, how to build them, and how to play them. Usually the format stabilizes around week 2. So at week 2 we can revisit those. At week 3 maybe we can revisit those graphs, and we can look at the format that is going to be more or less stable. If you didn't see it, I made an episode on the format evolution. It's on YouTube, so you can watch it, where I'm sort of looking at how does the format change on average. And from the previous sets that I looked at, it seems that after 2 weeks, the format is relatively stable. The ALSA numbers don't change that much, which means that the availability of the cards doesn't change almost till the end of the format. Which, on the other hand, means that new possibilities are open, and if you start figuring them out early after those 2 weeks, then you can be in the best position. I think that the period like between the end of week 2 and week 3, this is where you can gain the most traction over other players for the rest of the format, because that's when the format is more or less stable. So you can do predictable things. You don't have those wild shifts in the pick orders anymore. And you understand the format a bit better if you played it a bit, so you might know what is your pet deck and how to draft it and how to get on with it and which cards are super crucial for it to function and whatnot. So yeah, I think that the week 2 to week 3 are very important if you want to stay at high win rate until the end of the format. Oh, so not Gruel then Die says, I also had success with Boros. I wonder if people are playing it wrong in quotation marks since it's not a great aggro deck. It might be, or it might be that people over heavily try to lean on being cute with Samurai, which it probably is not always the case. And I'm pretty sure that it would have a higher win rate if people would play more Imperial Oaths, because Imperial Oaths is busted. But we're going to go through all the archetypes in a second. Oh, second has passed. We can go through all the archetypes. Yay. So for each archetype, I did 2 slides, one with commons, one with uncommons. And I put the MVP of the format, which is either the best win rate card or the best non-Saga win rate card, because for every archetype I also picked the best Saga, and sometimes Sagas were the best card overall, sometimes not. So if the Saga was the best card, then MVP is the actually second best card. Doesn't make sense, does it? And then I also picked a card that, at least from my perspective, looked interesting. It's very subjective. There are some criteria I selected them on, but I thought, okay, this is a card that maybe was not super intuitive to me. And it has a relatively high win rate. So I'm going to share that finding with you. Okay. So we start with blue-white, which obviously is a vehicles themed archetype. So it means maybe you can play a vehicle, but don't get stuck on the synergies because there aren't any. I think it's one of the archetypes that is not supported. And WotC has now the policy of supporting only 5 archetypes per limited format. So that was one that clearly had a weaker support. However, it's the color combination. I think it can be still good. And as I said, it's pretty open and there seem to be a lot of good cards in it. So the question is how you build it. The MVP of the archetype, the best common, is Imperial Oath with a majestic 63.4% win rate. And that tells us a lot about what you want to do in this archetype. You want to get to Imperial Oath, which means you want to control the board until then. You want to make sure that you don't miss your land drops. You want to get some advantage. You want to have some, maybe defensive removal is good, like the deal 4 to attacking creature might be pretty decent in there. The best Saga, Modern Age, 61.5%, so bit off Imperial Oath, but not too far. And I'm pretty much impressed with this card. It worked very well for me. It did some nice shenanigans. You know, if you're feeling cute and you have several Modern Ages, and you happen to have the 2-1, whenever you discard a card, you can play it until end of turn. I think the opening of the 2-1 on turn 2 and on turn 3, Modern Age, pitch a land, play a land, accrue value is an excellent opening, because it changes Modern Age into basically from draw a card and discard a card. It changes those chapters into draw a card, which is substantially better. And you end up with a decent 2-3 flyer. I have to say there is not much flying in the format. So flyers become slightly more valuable. I did run into big trouble with the Modern Age just attacking me for 2 every turn and me not being able to deal with it without some kind of hard removal. My pick for commons is Ninja's Kunai, because it had a pretty decent win rate, and it seems to me that it had pretty unimpressive win rate in general, so it seems like it's particularly good in blue-white, so that's worth noting. I think that, you know, especially if you want to do some kind of a white-blue with splashing things, you want to be able to play things like the Network Terminal, the 3-mana mana rock, that has 1 mana tap an artifact loot. And I think that Ninja's Kunai, you have to tap an artifact, so Ninja's Kunai is the artifact that you want to tap for using it, especially since Ninja's Kunai does not require tapping itself for the use, and it can be a removal whenever you need it. Yes, it seems good, but to be fair, Renshank says that it seems good with Tamashi. From my experience of trophying with the Tamashi deck, like everything is good with Tamashi. Jesus, that card is just busted. And talking about cards that are good with Tamashi, I skipped to the uncommon part of the Azorius. The MVP is the Circuit Mender. And by the way, I had a Tamashi deck with 2 Circuit Menders, and that was just busted. It's just like such a good combination that basically stops your opponent from having any hope and attacking. So Circuit Mender is 3 mana 2/3. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life, and when it leaves the battlefield, and I would like to put the emphasis on leaves the battlefield, you draw a card. Leaving the battlefield, including ninjutsuing it up. So, and because the opponent doesn't always want you to draw a card, this card can attack and maybe not get blocked, and then your ninja can bounce it, you draw a card anyway, which puts your opponent in such a terrible situation. But it is an MVP, but it's not the highest win rate card from uncommons in blue-white. The best one is actually Behold the Unspeakable, the Saga that gives -2/-0 to creatures your opponent controls for a turn. No, for 2 turns actually. Then it draws you some cards depending on your hand situation, and in the end turns into a XX flying trampler, with the X being the number of cards in your hand. That one has 63.3. I'd like to notice that Imperial Oath still has a higher win rate than any uncommon in this archetype. So just shows you how busted Oath is. My pick for the card that really surprised me, and I mean like really surprised me in this archetype, was Tawashi Guidebot. This 4-mana 2/1 that puts a counter on something when it enters the battlefield, and for 4 mana and a tap, you draw a card and it costs 1 less for each modified creature you control. I assume that this card is just like, this archetype wants to draw cards and accrue this extra value because it's a value deck. Don't mistake it with the vehicle deck. But I'm still quite surprised how high it was. It's 60% win rate is quite impressive for it. I was pretty much surprised. But yeah, in general, looking at the data, the white-blue seems to be good cards, value quality, with maybe some artifact synergies. Some cards that have artifact and enchantment synergies will also okay in it, because you get some enchantments in white. So yeah. I think that it's definitely got potential to improve by quite a lot in the later stages of the format. So definitely don't feel like you should avoid it. I think that it's open enough that once black and green are going to be more, what's the name, contested. When black and green become more contested, I think that white blue is going to be a very, very fine alternative that you might get in. Obviously, once people get a bit on Imperial Oath, it will become weaker, because you won't be able to get any number of the oaths, which is pretty useful. Okay. Orzo. Guess what? Guess what card is the MVP? It is Imperial Oath, but with 63% win rate roughly. It's not the best card. The best card is Okiba Reckoner Raid, the Rat Saga. 1 mana, drains for 2 over the first 2 chapters, and then 3rd chapter turns into a 2/2 menace. Card is busted, especially in multiples. It works fine. Nothing to say here. It's quite obvious that it's good. Imperial Oath still good in that deck. My pick for an interesting card was the Kami of Terrible Secrets. Obviously, this card was supposed to be good in white-black, but supposed to be good and is actually good is not necessarily synonymous, as we've seen in the previous sets. There are some cards that are heavy misses. This one looked pretty much underwhelming to me in the pre-format analysis, but it actually looks like the numbers are supporting it. So it got 58.3% win rate. This is a 4-mana 3/4 that if you control an artifact and an enchantment as it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and gain 1 life. Yeah, I think that as Dunks mentioned in the chat, this card requires careful deck construction. You want to be really having a balanced number of artifacts and enchantments, but once you do, it does the job. I'm actually really thinking, is it okay to play things like Ecologist's Terrarium and keep it on the battlefield until you really need it, just to have that artifact for sure on the board, and then some enchantments to enable it. Oh yeah, and Renchang says that Shrine Steward is a great card for that, and it is, because it puts artifact on board and it draws you an enchantment, so it fulfills both criteria very easily. Now, when we look at the uncommons, again, MVP, again, Circuit Mender, best uncommon already in 2 decks in a row. And I think that Circuit Mender is generally a very strong card. and particularly in archetypes that look at a more grindy, value-oriented kind of, and maybe more defensive um, plan. So Circuit Mender, again, MVP, but again, not the best card. The best card is a Saga, and of course, it is also the best Saga. And that's the Life of Toshiro Umezawa, 65.1% win rate, which is amazing. Circuit Mender, 63.6. So Life of Toshiro Umezawa, the first two chapters are basically GT, and if someone doesn't know, you can choose either a creature gets +2/+2, or a creature gets -1/-1, or you gain 2 life. Very versatile and can kill quite a lot in this format because there is a lot of X1s. And on the backside is just a 2/3 that taps for black mana. Some synergies, it can ramp you into the Imperial Oath, and it also worked well with the black invoke spell because it gives you black mana, so that makes it as playable if you have Toshiro. The card I selected that again surprised me is When We Were Young, and that's instant. Up to 2 target creatures each get +2/+2 until end of turn. If you control an artifact and enchantment, those creatures also gain lifelink until end of turn. Now this seems like you need to fulfill a bunch of conditions. So I thought this card is going to be awful, although the art is beautiful and I love it, and no one is going to change my mind on that. But it turns out that win rate is 59%, which is really decent. So it seems like black is capable of having 2 creatures on board and also an artifact and an enchantment, because that's what you require to accrue the full value of it. And with the full value, that can do a really hefty swing. So maybe in a particular build that is creature heavy and has a good number of artifacts and enchantments, this card can be pretty powerful. Right, let's move to the white-red. Now, white-red, as I said, very poor numbers, but it's one of the allegedly supported archetypes, so let's look at it. Guess which... Oh, there is a wrong number there. That must be 56.3. MVP is again Imperial Oath, as in the other white decks. Just to prove the point that people like Jason ILTG and NCAA, who was earlier in the chat, were absolutely right to overhype the card before the set hit. Imperial Oath looks like an MVP of white in general on the common level. The interesting part is the best Saga. Oh, the Imperial has 57.6% win rate. The best Saga is the Shattered States era, which is more a testament to how bad the Sagas are in the white-red deck than anything else. The win rate is a measly 52.5. It seems that common Sagas in white-red just don't work. And my pick is Spirited Companion, which is the 1/1 doggo that draws a card. It's an enchantment creature that has 56.3% win rate. It's a solid card. I just wanted to give some love to the good boyo because the good boyo is just so good. In every archetype, it was close second or third to Imperial Oath, but every single time it was losing out to it. In terms of the uncommons, the MVP is the Twin Shot Sniper. No surprises there. The 4-mana reach artifact creature. When it ETBs, deals 2 damage to any target, or you can channel it to deal 2 damage to any target. The card is really good. And the best Saga with a really decent 57.5% win rate is the Fall of Lord Konda. And I didn't see it perform extremely well in any other archetype. So in white-red, it seems to fulfill some kind of a role that is important, possibly removing a big blocker. And my pick for the card, these are, by the way, top 3 cards from this uncommons, top 3 uncommons from this archetype. So my pick was Banishing Slash. This card also has good numbers across the board. It's a white-white sorcery, destroy up to 1 target artifact, enchantment, or tapped creature. Then if you control an artifact and an enchantment, create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance. So if you can get the full value of it, perfect. If you don't, well, you still kill something. It's like a sorcery speed disenchant with the potential of killing a creature. So yeah, these are the white-red. I guess that this archetype requires a lot of thinking and working through it. I had 2 trophies with it, but I still don't know how. I just played creatures and attacked with them. To be fair, that was the whole of my plan, and it somehow worked. I had some, like decent uncommons and bunch of the signpost ones and flyers that could push through. So that was the plan. Okay, white green. I mean, would you take a guess at what is the best common? Obviously, Imperial Oath at 62.3% win rate. The best Saga was not in top 3, but it was maybe like a 6th best green common. That was Tales of Master Sashiro. First 2 chapters put a +1/+1 counter on something, and it comes back as a 5/5 Vigi Trumpler and a Vigi Haste creature. So like a really solid top end. My pick for the card that impresses in this archetype is Season of Renewal. 3 mana instant, choose one or both, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, or return return target enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. That has a solid 59.7% win rate, which looks good. And this is like something that the archetype wants to do: play enchantments, maybe channel some of the green ones, and then this allows you to recoup some value. So for example, you can use Tanuki to ramp yourself into 6 mana, then Season of Renewal it, return back to your hand and replay it, for example. In terms of uncommons, it's mono green. MVP is Blossom Prancer, the 5 mana 4/4 with reach, and that reach is very secret. I'm so much seeing people attacking into it. And it looks at top 5 cards in your library. You may reveal a creature or an enchantment from among them if you need so. And if you don't find anything that you're really impressed with, then you can gain 4 life. So the card is just like so busted. I mean, it does so much, and the win rate reflects that, like 66.5 in white green, which is 66.5. That's comma in Kamigawa, like the best mythic rare. Best Saga is Boseiju Reaches Skyward, another super busted card. First chapter, you look for 2 forests. Second chapter, second chapter doesn't exist, let's be honest. Third chapter, you return it as a XX, where X is the number of lands. So basically, if you look for 2 forests, it will be a 6/6 with reach. And the third card that I picked, it's also the third best uncommon. Kapatek Wrecker. The card is just insane. You can lock people with it in the basically situation when they can't do anything about it. It's a ninjutsu green 1, and also it costs green 1. 1/3 enters the battlefield with a death touch counter, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may remove a death touch counter from it when you do exile target artifact or enchantment that player controls. Card is amazing. And the win rate is 65.7. Boseiju had 65.9. These are all like super busted. And there's plenty of white green, very high win rate cards. So the archetype seems to be super support. Now looking at ninjutsu decks. So the blue black MVP, and I was shocked by that, is Virus Beetle. Virus Beetle, the humble artifact Ravenous Rat, has the win rate of 64.7. Like, again, at the level that is usually reserved for top rares in the format. And I was surprised by that. I thought it would be the Network Disruptor, but no, it's Virus Beetle. And that's even before the correction for the bouncing and multiple copies, although Virus Beetle also gets bounced a substantial amount of time. Best Saga, Okibo Reckoner rate, as before, 63.4. No surprises there. The Saga is busted. And the card that I selected that has interesting numbers is Suit Up. 3 mana instant. Until end of turn, target creature or vehicle becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 4/5. Draw a card. And this has 60%. This has a 60% win rate, which is great, because this again makes decisions for opponent a nightmare. Because if you have it, you attack with some small creatures. They don't block it. You can ninjutsu something. They block it. You can suit it up, and in a similar fashion, you can play ninjutsu with them. You're already dead when if they damned if they block, damned if they don't. Yeah, you can put opponent in really tough spots there. Yeah, and this also can work on defense or whatever. In terms of uncommons, we have two old friends. MVP is a Circuit Mender, but it's not the best card. The best card is the Saga, and that Saga is Life of Toshiro Mizawa, just like before. Circuit Mender still busted, especially with ninjutsu. It gains a lot because you can bounce it to your hand to draw a card, replay it, gain 2 life, and just becomes insane. Life of Toshiro Mizawa, Jita is still good in 2022. And the card that I selected as my pick was the Long Reach of Night. It's a Saga with the first chapter being each opponent sacrifice a creature unless they discard a card. And I know that it's bugged, but hopefully they cleaned the bug today. And it turns into an 0/4 that when it attacks, it gains menace, and its power becomes as much as the number of creature cards in the opponent's graveyard, if I remember correctly. I didn't play a single copy of that card to Jordan, so you have nothing on me. Nothing. But I saw Corticals abusing it all the time. No, he wasn't, but he was playing it a lot. The card is still good, and even if they repair the bug, it's going to be pretty strong. Okay, so that's blue-black is quite simple. You want to ninja things in, but the important part is that you don't see any ninjas in the top cards, which means that ninjas are very much replaceable in what you're playing, or not as important as the things that you return to your hand. Like Virus Beetle and Circuit Mender being the top non-saga cards is telling you something. And 2 top cards being Sagas also tells you something about Sagas. Okay. Blue-red. And yeah, it would be hard pushed to think it's blue-red when you look at this slide, unless you read the title. MVP is a Moon Circuit Hacker. So in the blue-red artifacts matter archetype, an enchantment creature is the best win rate. So yeah, that's interesting. That's a ninja. So unlike a ninja deck, in blue-red we actually do see ninjas as the top cards. It has ninjutsu 1. Whenever it deals damage to a player, you may loot, unless it entered the battlefield this turn, when you just draw a card straight. That's a very fine card with lots of trick potential, win rate of 60.6, so very fine. But it tells you something, that blue-red does want to play this sort of like aggro, but with a lot of card advantage strategy. Then you have the Modern Age as the best Saga, but it's got the win rate of 56, which is not impressive. We already talked about the card, so I won't repeat. Network Disruptor, the menace of game in hand win rate statistic. The 1 mana 1/1 flying, when it enters the battlefield, tap target permanent. It's my pick for the deck because I think it's been close to the number 1 in multiple archetypes, and here it also has good numbers, so I just put it as my selection just to showcase that the card is still good. Like from what you see in the comments, the picture of blue-red is that the archetype theme is nothing that you should really focus on. If you want to have the best results, focus on tempo type play. You want your 1-drops, you want your 2-drops, you want your upgrades, you want your things that tap something when they ETB even in the late game to remove a blocker. And yeah, flying is obviously important. So I think that blue-red can play a fine tempo game. It just requires a bit thinking about how to build it. And I think that the colors are still maybe not open enough to do so. But it might change as soon as people start drafting drafting black and green more highly, as I expect will happen soon, especially with green. Then we have Twin Shot Sniper. We already talked about this card. This is the clear MVP of the archetype, 61.6% win rate. Best Saga is Behold the Unspeakable. We also talked about it, the XX Flying Trampler one that draws you cards and stops people from attacking you for a turn. And my pick for a card with a really good win rate is Patchwork Automaton, the 2-mana artifact with ward 2, and whenever you cast an artifact spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It has a 61% win rate, and the card looks pretty solid. The ward 2 is really good on the early drop creature, and you can grow quite quickly if you play the right version. So maybe Patchwork Automaton will require a bit more of the artifact synergies, and you definitely don't want to ninjutsu it back to your hand after you put 5 counters on it, for example. But yeah, the card seems like there was a lot of hype about this Dragon Spark reactor. Do I remember the name correctly? The removal that grows with the game when you play artifacts, but Patchwork Automaton is just like a much better version of it when it comes to going for the opponent's face. Yeah, exactly, Renshang. The card that was very much overhyped in the beginning of the format, and it's been all by disappointment. It's been only disappointment from what I saw on other people board states. Again, I never drew it or drafted it, so lucky me. But Patchwork Automaton looks good. So if you're looking for something that grows with the game in terms of artifact synergies, I think the Automaton is the one that you're looking for. Okay, blue-green. MVP, clear MVP is Fang of Shigeki, a mighty, majestic 1/1 Death Touch. That's also an enchantment. Yeah, quite a big surprise to me, honestly, because I thought the card would be slightly better than people say, but I didn't think that much better. It looks amazing in this archetype in terms of the numbers. It might drop over time, but still, it seems that blue-green wants to survive so badly that a 1/1 Death Toucher is just good enough. And with some synergies of recurring it or some ETB effects for enchantments, it can be quite solid. Quite solid. 61.6% win rate for a common is insane. The best Saga is Modern Age with 60.8. Again, you fix your draws, so you will allow yourself to survive till the late game because you have a bit of more card selection. You can chuck away the cards that will not help you in doing that, or in the late game, you can accumulate a couple of lands and turn them into real spells. So it's all fine, and the 2/3 body is actually surprisingly solid. And my pick for the surprise or interesting card is Harmonious Emergence. We've seen this type of card a bunch of times. It's a 4-mana enchantment for a land. Enchanted creature becomes a 4/5 spirit with vigilance and haste. It's still a land. And normally those cards are mediocre to worse than mediocre. This one looks pretty solid. It has 61% win rate in the blue-green. I think, it turns the corner a bit because it can attack the first turn it enters the battlefield. It doesn't cost you a land because if you don't need a blocker, you can just tap the land for mana, and if you don't need to tap the land for mana, then you have a blocker. That's basically it. So it doesn't slow you down like most of those cards normally did, because they require tapping for attacking. And also, when it's destroyed, you don't lose a land, which is very useful. So it's like super pumped version of the spell, and it seems to be working, at least in the blue-green. Yeah, so Harmonious Emergence looks pretty solid, and I would say don't sleep on the card. It looks good. Like the 4/5 body is just breaking so many things that that probably is yeah. And so the dunk says that no, Isaiah MTG says that the vigilance seems very important, but I think that it's not only the case. The problem with those cards very often was that you kill them and then you sort of like one land short, and especially in a deck that is very mana hungry, and this card just doesn't have that effect, and this is maybe not as important as vigilance, but this is pretty important in my opinion for the playability of the card. Okay. In terms of uncommons, MVP is the Kappa Tech Wrecker again. Yeah, the card is busted, as I already said, and probably even more so in the blue-green, with a modest win rate of 68.6%. It's just mental. The best Saga is Behold the Unspeakable, with 66.4%, which is solid. And, you know, the Boseji Saga is just very close to it. They're almost like tied for it. And the card that I selected for this deck as my surprise include is the Spinning Wheel Kick. Now, this card before the set was released was played down by a lot of people, including myself. But it shows good numbers, at least in this archetype. 60.8% win rate is not bad at all. It's over replacement, and it maybe is the reason because instant removal in this format is not particularly great, and a 1/1 Death Toucher is particularly great. So this can do a whole lot of mess in the opponent's battlefield. Yeah, so what the Sphinx revealed says that with the amount of Death Touch in green, it makes it almost a Plague Wind. And yes, it does. It does. Kappa Tech Wrecker and Fang of Shigeki, both of them are pretty solid. Not to mention that green has some chunkers that can do it without Death Touch. Okay, let's look at the black-red. So the best common in black-red is Experimental Synthesizer. I wanted to, well, the second best, because the best one is Okiba Reckoner Raid. It seems to me that black-red is the real artifact deck. And having said that, the two of the three commons I show you here are enchantments, but apart from that, there's a bunch of artifacts in the format, and it has ways of generating more artifacts without the cardboard involved. Experimental Synthesizer is the, obviously, as everyone knows, the Mold Drifter. So 5 mana, draw, 4 mana, draw 2 cards, basically. Now, it's 1 red mana artifact. When it enters or leaves battlefield, exile the top card of your library. So if you play carefully with it, it will become a sort of Mold Drifter, because you can sacrifice it for 3 mana and create a 2/2 white samurai creature with vigilance. If you play it carefully, you play it for 1 mana with enough mana to play anything that you want. You probably want to be very low to the ground in those decks anyway. So if you have 3 mana free when you play it, you should be fine, or 2 mana and a land in hand that you can play. And in the later game, you can get a samurai, or you can sacrifice it to some other effect and still get the possibility of playing a card from the top. Unless you're my opponents and you just sacrifice it for 3 and hit the land of top at 0 lands on board. So yeah, that can also happen. Okiba Raid, we already talked in detail. The nice part is that there are some rare black vehicles, or just generally rare vehicles are pretty good in this deck. And with Okiba Reckoner Raid, they just become way better. The card I wanted to showcase is Clawing Torment. It's an enchantment aura. Enchanted artifact or creature, as long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets -1/-1 and cannot block. Enchanted permanent has, at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life. Now, This card is good. It's not like busted, but it's good. The 59% win rate is solid, and you can do some really awful things to your opponents if they are not ready to sacrifice their creature. Like putting it on, for example, on the 3/3 defender reach green creature is fantastic because it removes something that is particularly good against you because the 3/3 blocker is annoying, and also it sort of creates this inevitable clock for the opponent because usually the decks that want to play the 3/3 reach turtle, they don't have a way of killing the sacrificing the 3/3 reach turtle, so they can use removal on it, I guess, which is not optimal for them, or maybe destroy the enchantment, which is also not optimal for them. So yeah, card seems good. Especially that your main engine of the deck is Onicult Anvil, which is my pick for the interesting uncommon. That's the only signpost that made the list, which is also something very, very peculiar. The signpost uncommons usually are the best cards in their color combination, but not in this set. In this set, they are deep, deep in, you know, like 5th to 7th best uncommon for the color combination, which is super weird. MVP, Twin Shot Sniper and Life of Toshiro Umezawa. We know those two already from any archetype before. They are just busted. Life of Toshiro Umezawa, 63% win rate. Twin Shot Sniper, 62.7. Oh, 63.6, 62.7. They are clearly the best. But Onicult Anvil, the signpost uncommon for black-red, has 61% win rate, which is solid. Notably, it was also good in blue-red as a splash, but I didn't put splash cards in the lists. So yeah. Onicult Anvil. Whenever one or more artifacts you control leave the battlefield during your turn, important, create a 1/1 colorless construct artifact creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn, and you can sacrifice an artifact and it deals 1 damage to each opponent. You gain 1 life. So you can imagine that if you already have this kind of draining engine like Onicult Anvil, Cloring Torment just speeds up the clock substantially, so you can sort of build your own like collection of pestilences, really, or not pestilences, but ill-gotten gains or something like that. Works pretty well. And the deck, I think that the deck is really reliant on getting those Onicult Anvils, which I think is why I put it on the list here. Well, let's go to the best deck. Let's go to the best deck of the format so far, and that's black-green. Now, first of all, the best common is Twisted Embrace, the 4-mana enchantment aura. When Twisted Embrace enters the battlefield, destroy target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. As long as an enchantment permanent is a creature, it gets +1/+1. Now, this is the only archetype with this card as a top common. It's not bad in other ones, but in this one, it's particularly good. The reason for that being, of course, Geothermal Kami that can bounce it back to your hand and replay it on something else and kill another creature, which makes it a fantastic 2-for-1 while you gain life and create a cushion and a sizable blocker. The best Saga at common is Okiba Reckoner Raid. Who knew? Thing is still good. And my pick for the card that was looking really good in this archetype was the Fate into Antiquity, 3-mana exile target artifact or enchantment. In the pre-release episode, I was talking about this card has really a lot of targets, and it seems that win rate seems to confirm that this is a good removal that should be playing at least one copy of based on the numbers that we see here. And yeah, I mean, Geothermal Kami is an honorable mention here. The card also has a pretty decent win rate and does something that can turn a mediocre deck into a good deck by bouncing those Twisted Embraces, for example. Best uncommons, MVP Blossom Prancer, 68.1% win rate. This is just mental. Best Saga, I was actually surprised, but the Long Reach of the Night, the one where you can sacrifice a creature unless opponent sacrifices a creature unless they discard a card. and then turns into an 0-4 with some kind of a graveyard synergies. It's really, really, really good numbers. Better than the Boseji, which is actually surprising to me, and better than Life of Toshiro Omazawa. Oh, did they fix it? Okay, so Isaiah says that they repaired the bug that it had. I still think that the card is going to be good with the bug fixed, and at least it will be a fair card. That's great. Now I can start drafting it. And my pick again is Kappa Tech Wrecker because the win rate of 67.5 requires a mention. Okay, okay, that's good. It's fixed then. That's fine. I don't think that it's going to be okay. And the last archetype we're going to be talking today is red green, and my message about red green is avoid it. Not because you can't get a good red green deck, I think, but I think that the risk of getting a bad red green deck is just too high. From what I saw in terms of openness and the card quality, and I just think that this archetype is just so half-heartedly supported, and that I would say for now avoid it. Wait for people to build better versions, unless you want to experiment, which of course I highly encourage. If you want to experiment building something, then do it. I think that the signpost uncommon does not post good numbers. Modified creatures don't have enough support. Like it's hard to get them. Like it would even be good if you would be able to reliably activate the 2/3 3 mana 2/3 that enters as a 3/4 when you control a modified creature, but you just don't. There's just not enough 1 mana or 2 mana things that are modified. So yeah, there you go. I would say avoid it for now, and maybe think about how to make it better. Right, now my voice is completely gone. I go to the acknowledgement section. So, as always, thanks to the 17 Lands team who are amazing and support me and support, well, all of us to be fair, in terms of getting good data out for our limited needs. So, Viral Misnomer, Hululu, and Grant Wu are people that are involved in it quite heavily and are also present on Twitter. So, I recommend you to follow them to see what they have to say about what's cooking in 17 Lands world. Also, thanks to Fake Jake Brown for helping me with releasing the podcast version of this. And thank you to Asescu and Mana Junkie for the theme song if you're listening to this in the podcast version. And yeah, thanks. This was the first shallow dive into the Kamigawa data, but over the next week, the format is great. So over the next week, I'm definitely going to try to figure out some deeper takes based on the data we get, and maybe talk about signals and how to read them in this particular format, and how the drafts go, and mulliganing strategies and things like that. I'm going to see that. But for now, thank you very much, and thanks for listening.